I was somewhere I had no business being alone. The drive out to the Sandres Range had taken 4 hours on roads that stopped being roads about 40 minutes in, and by the time I'd pitched my tent in a dry wash off of two-track trail that didn't have a name on any map I owned, the sun was already bleeding out behind the ridgeline. I'd been doing this kind of thing for 11 years. Remote solo camping, the kind where you tell one person where you're going and hope that's enough. So the silence didn't bother me. The silence was the point. I'd brought the Yaesu FT-8A because I always brought the Yaesu FT-818. It's a small handheld ham radio transceiver about the size of a paperback novel and out in the high desert where the electromagnetic noise floor drops to almost nothing. You can pull signals out of the air that you'd never hear anywhere else. Satellite beacons. Weather stations. Occasionally, if the ionosphere is behaving, voices from the other side of the planet. I'd been licensed for 9 years. This was routine for me. I set up the antenna after dinner, a fold-up wire dipole strung between 2 creosote bushes, and started scanning. It was around 8:30. Sky was clear. Temperature had already dropped 15 degrees from the afternoon high, and I was working through the 40-meter band with a cup of instant coffee going cold in my left hand. Most of what I found was what I expected. Distant SSB chatter in Spanish, a packet data burst, the rhythmic clunk of an automated weather beacon somewhere over Arizona. Standard stuff. I logged a few contacts out of habit and was about to pack it in when I crossed a frequency I hadn't planned to stop on. 7.333 megahertz, which sits in a part of the band that's technically allocated but rarely used for voice out here. Usually just static. What I heard instead was a voice. Not a conversation. Not a broadcast. Just a single male voice, flat and unhurried, reading numbers 14, 13, 12, 11. I set down the coffee. Number stations aren't unheard of on ham frequencies. They're a Cold War relic, and there are still a few active ones operated by various governments, for reasons nobody officially acknowledges. But they have known frequencies, known schedules. They get logged by hobbyists worldwide. You can look them up. And they don't transmit on 7333. I'd been monitoring this band for nearly a decade and had never heard anything like this on it. 9, 8, 7. The voice had no accent I could place, no static behind it. It sounded like it was coming from a room, not a field station. There was a faint room tone quality to it, the subtle acoustic signature of 4 walls. I grabbed my notebook and started logging the frequency, the time, the signal strength. Old habit. 11. 8:34 p.m. local. 5, 4, 3. I remember thinking, countdown to what? 2, 1 silence. Not stealthy. Actual silence. The kind you only get when a transmitter cuts off completely, leaving the frequency dead clean. I waited 40 seconds, maybe a minute. Then the voice came back, 14, 13, 12, same pace, same tone. Starting over. I switched to my phone and pulled up a signal mapping app I use to gauge propagation. Basically, it shows you the likely origin radius of a signal based on band conditions and signal strength. At 40 meters on that night, with the ionosphere in the state it was in, a signal of that strength shouldn't have been traveling more than about 200 miles. Probably less, given the terrain. That put the transmitter somewhere in New Mexico, possibly southern Colorado. Close enough that I felt something shift in my chest that I didn't immediately have a name for. I kept listening. The countdown cycled 3 more times without variation. No additional content, no call sign, which is a legal requirement for any licensed transmission on that band. Whoever was broadcasting was either unlicensed or didn't care. I noted that too. It was on the 5th cycle that I noticed the number, 14. It always started at 14. I don't know what made me do it. Curiosity, or something quieter and less rational than curiosity. But I got up from my camp chair and I paced it out, from the center of my tent to the edge of the tree line, the point where the desert scrub thickened into the low shadow mass of juniper and pinon that bordered the wash to the north. I counted my steps. I have a 32-inch stride. I've measured it. 14 steps puts me at roughly 14.5 feet. But that's not what I was counting. I was counting footfalls, the same way you count anything when you're not entirely sure why you're counting. I stopped at the edge of the tree line and turned around. 14 steps. I stood there for a moment in the dark, with the radio still going in my camp chair 30 behind me. The flat voice cycling through its countdown again, and I tried to construct a rational explanation with the materials I had available. Coincidence. Confirmation bias. The fact that I'd been alone for 6 hours, and my brain was doing what human brains do in isolation. Pattern matching against the noise, finding shapes in static. All of those explanations were available to me. I tried each one, then I took one step back, out of the tree line, and I paced it again from a different starting point, from the left rear stake of my tent, which I could just see in the glow of my headlamp. Deliberately different. Deliberately testing. I counted as I walked. When my foot came down on 14, I stopped. I was standing in exactly the same place. The soil there was soft. This was a dry wash, and the substrate was fine alluvial sand that holds impressions well. I shone my headlamp down at my feet. There were footprints in the sand. Not mine. These were older, edges slightly weathered, made by a boot with a different tread pattern than the Salomon trail runners I was wearing. Someone had stood in this exact spot before. I went back to the radio. The countdown was on 8. I didn't touch the dial. I wrote everything down in the notebook, and then I sat there finishing my cold coffee and listening to the voice cycle through the same 14 numbers, over and over, until sometime after midnight, when the signal simply stopped and the frequency went back to normal static and didn't come back. I filed a report with the FCC the following week, logged the anomaly on 3 different ham radio forums, and got one response from a guy in Albuquerque who said he'd heard something similar on that same frequency. About 8 months earlier, he'd been camping near the Jemez Mountains. He'd also paced it out. He didn't say what number he'd reached. When I asked, he didn't reply. I've been back to that wash twice since then. Both times I've brought the Yaisu and spent several hours scanning that frequency at night. Both times, nothing. I keep telling myself that the footprint was old, that people walk that wash, that the number was a coincidence, that my stride is inconsistent enough to make the measurement unreliable. I keep telling myself there's a licensed operator somewhere in this state running an unlicensed countdown transmission on a quiet frequency for a reason that has nothing to do with me. Most days I believe that. But I haven't been able to camp without pacing the distance to the tree line first. Every site, every trip. Before I set up the tent, before I eat, before I do anything else. I walk to the nearest tree line and I count my steps. So far, the number has always been different so far. The granola bar wrapper was still in my jacket pocket when everything changed. I remember that detail because I'd been snapping pieces off a Nature Valley Crunch bar and handing them back to her one at a time the whole drive up, and when we finally parked at the Shawnee National Forest trailhead and I zipped my jacket, I stuffed the empty wrapper in my pocket instead of the trash bag like I always told her to do. Small thing. The kind of small thing you remember later because your brain is desperate to pinpoint the last normal moment before everything tilted. We'd been planning this trip for 6 weeks, just the two of us. A long weekend, late September, the kind of weather where the Illinois hill country actually looks like something worth driving 3 hours to see. She was 8, old enough to be a real hiking companion, young enough that she still thought camping with her mother was genuinely cool and not something to be embarrassed about. I knew that window was closing. I wanted to use it while I still had it. We set up camp Friday afternoon at a walk-in site about a quarter mile from the parking area. Site number 7, which she'd picked off the reservation map because 7 was her favorite number. She helped stake the rainfly. She arranged both sleeping bags herself with a level of geometric precision that made me laugh. We ate pasta from a camp pot, and she beat me at 3 consecutive rounds of rummy by the light of a black diamond spot headlamp. And I remember thinking, this is exactly what I wanted this to be. Saturday was the kind of day you take too many pictures of because you're afraid you won't believe it happened. We did the river-to-river trail loop, maybe 4 miles, stopped at a creek crossing where she took her shoes off and stood in the water up to her shins, making a sound like she'd discovered something holy. I made sandwiches on a flat rock. She found a crayfish. It was perfect in the specific, unrepeatable way that perfect days with children always are. It was Saturday evening when it started. We'd come back to camp around 5:30, both of us muddy and satisfied. I'd started a small fire and was digging through the food bag when she said she needed to use the bathroom. The pit toilet was about 80 meters up the main path. I'd used it that morning, knew exactly where it was, could see the start of the path from where I was sitting. In daylight, 80 meters. I said, okay. I said, take the headlamp. I said, come straight back. She was gone 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I checked my phone when she left. It was 5:41, and I checked it again when I heard her footsteps coming back down the path. 5:45. 4 minutes for a round trip to the toilet and back. Normal, fine. She came and sat down across the fire from me. I handed her the bag of trail mix and asked if she'd washed her hands at the pump. She nodded, but she was looking at the fire, not at me, just staring into it with both hands in her lap, not touching the trail mix. I watched her for a moment. You okay? She nodded again. Same flat quality, same stillness. This was a child who was constitutionally incapable of sitting still, who narrated her own thoughts out loud without realizing she was doing it, who had been providing running commentary on every bird and rock and cloud formations since we left the house. The quiet was wrong in a way I felt before I understood. Did something happen? She looked up at me then. Her expression wasn't scared. That's the thing I keep coming back to. It wasn't fear. It was something more like careful attention, like she was concentrating on getting the words right. A man talked to me, she said. The fire popped. I didn't move. At the bathroom? On the path. She looked back at the fire. He was standing on the side of the path. Not a ranger. He had regular clothes. I set down what I was holding. What did he say? She recited it, not like she was remembering, like she was playing it back. He said, hey, tell your mom I said, hey. And then he said, tell her I'll come by later to introduce myself. I held very still. Did he say anything else? She thought about it. He said, you can go ahead. I'll wait here for a little while. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the 2 hours since we'd gotten back to camp, but I became aware of the cold in a new way then, the kind that isn't about weather. I asked her what he looked like. She said she didn't know. I asked what color was his jacket. She said she didn't look at his jacket. I asked if he was tall. She said she didn't know. I asked how old. She scrunched her face. Like a dad, she said, which told me almost nothing and also, in some way I can't fully articulate, told me more than I wanted to know. There was a man on that path who had specifically directed a child not to look at him. I got us into the tent inside of 2 minutes. Sleeping bags, food bag hung, shoes inside. I pulled the zipper and sat in the dark with my back against the tent wall facing the door, and my phone in my hand. I called the park's emergency line. It rang 6 times and went to a recording. I called 911 and explained the situation. Child contacted by unknown adult. At a campsite, intentional language. Suspect still possibly in the area. The dispatcher was calm and kind and said she'd send a ranger. While I waited, I sat with my daughter in that tent, and I let her lean against me, and I watched the zipper pull, and I talked to her about nothing. What trail we'd do tomorrow, whether crayfish could live in a fish tank. I made my voice the same temperature as every other night of her life, because she was 8 and she was tired and she'd done everything right. And there was no reason she needed to feel the specific quality of alertness that was running through me like current. The ranger arrived 40 minutes later. She was thorough, walked the path with a flashlight, checked the toilet area, took a description from my daughter that amounted to medium height, maybe 50, regular clothes, no hat. She said there'd been no other incidents reported that weekend. She said she'd do a drive-through of the lot. She gave me her direct number and told me to call if anything happened, and I said I would, and I already knew I wouldn't be in that campsite when morning came. We broke camp at 9 p.m. by headlamp. My daughter thought it was an adventure, packing up in the dark, hauling our gear up the trail to the car, the mystery of it. She asked if we were going home, and I said no, we're going to get a hotel with a pool, which was true. I'd already found one 30 minutes south on my phone. She cheered, in the car, backing out of the lot. My headlights swung across the tree line at the far edge of the parking area. There was a man standing in it, not moving, just standing back in the trees at the exact point where the light reached before going dark. Widen. I couldn't make out features. I couldn't make out anything except the shape. The upright, still, unmistakably human shape of someone standing in the trees at the edge of a parking lot at 9:15 at night, watching the only car that was leaving. I pulled onto the road, and I drove, and I didn't look in the rear view mirror for a long time. At the hotel, I ran the pool water warm while she changed into her swimsuit, and I sat on the edge of the tub watching her splash around. And I thought about the sentence, "Tell her I'll come by later to introduce myself." It was the grammar that kept snagging in me. Come by. Introduce myself. Informal. Social. The language of a neighbor returning a borrowed tool. Language designed to sound normal, coming out of a child's mouth. To land gently. To not trigger alarm until you sat alone in the dark and turned it over and understood what it actually was. It was a message. Delivered through my daughter, precisely because it would lose its teeth in her voice. Calculated in a way that still makes my stomach drop when I follow it to its conclusion. We finished the weekend at the hotel. She had a great time. She still talks about the crayfish. I have not taken her camping since. I keep meaning to. I keep telling myself that one man in one park is not the woods, is not every trail, is not the thing I built this tradition to be. I tell myself she deserves more of those days. The river crossings, the headlamp card games, the rain fly staking, the specific and irreplaceable joy of a child who still thinks camping with her mother is cool. I tell myself all of that. I just haven't been able to make myself go back. We had been walking for 3 hours before either of us admitted something was wrong. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the cairns themselves, not the moment we first noticed the pattern, but the 3 hours before that, the part where we both felt it and said nothing. There's a specific social contract between two people on a trail together, especially two people who have been friends long enough to have something to prove to each other. And part of that contract is, you don't say the thing out loud until you absolutely have to. Saying it out loud makes it real, and neither of us wanted it to be real. We'd started the McAfee Knob section of the Appalachian Trail at 6:40 in the morning, which was earlier than we needed to, but later than we'd planned, because the night before in the car we'd made the mistake of opening the cooler, and one thing led to another. And by 11 p.m., we were sitting on the trunk lid in a Roanoke parking lot, eating cold cuts straight from the bag and laughing about nothing. Classic. We were 22. Sleep was theoretical. The trail starts easy. Everyone says that about McAfee Knob, and everyone is right. The first 2 miles are a long, steady climb through hardwood forest. Oak and hickory mostly, with enough canopy coverage that even in late October, you're not getting much direct light until you gain some elevation. It was cold that morning, the kind of cold that feels good when you're moving, and the trail was leaf-covered but clear and well-marked. White blazes on the trees every 100 meters or so. We'd both hiked sections of the AT before. We knew how it worked. The cairns appeared around mile 2.5. Cairns on the AT aren't standard. The trail uses painted blazes. That's the whole system, has been since the 30s. Cairns show up occasionally above tree line, where there's nothing to paint on, but in the middle of a hardwood forest, on a well-established trail, you don't build cairns. There's no reason to. The trail is right there. The first one was small. 4 or 5 flat stones stacked about knee height, sitting about 3 feet off the right side of the trail. I noticed it but didn't think much. People build cairns for fun. Kids, mostly. You see them near water features at scenic overlooks. I stepped around it and kept walking. The second one was 100 meters further. Same construction, flat, stacked stones, roughly knee height. This one sitting directly on the trail itself rather than beside it. My hiking partner nudged it with his boot as he passed, and one stone fell off. Neither of us said anything. The third was 50 meters after that, and the fourth was maybe 30 meters after that. And then the spacing tightened again. 20 meters, then 15, and each one was slightly taller than the last, the construction slightly more deliberate, the stones chosen with more care. By cairn number 8 or 9, I had slowed down without deciding to. He noticed I'd slowed and slowed too. We looked at each other and did the thing where neither person asks the question directly. Weird hobby, he said. Yeah, I said. We kept walking. Here's what I want you to understand about the next hour, because this is where the story becomes difficult to explain in a way that sounds rational. We were on the Appalachian Trail. We had a map, an actual paper map, a National Geographic Trails Illustrated, waterproofed, the kind that doesn't fail. We had GPS on both our phones. We had the white blazes above us on the trees, visible and consistent. There was, by every navigational measure available to us, no ambiguity about where we were or where the trail went. And yet the cairns kept appearing ahead of us. Not beside the trail now. Ahead of it, placed in the center of the path at intervals that were getting shorter and shorter. Each one a little taller, a little more carefully made, until around what I estimated was mile 4, we came around a bend and found one that came up to my chest. 12, maybe 14 stones, perfectly balanced. The top stone was flat and smooth and pale, almost white, and someone had placed it with the kind of precision that takes time. We stopped in front of it and stood there for a moment. Pull up the GPS, I said. Not because I doubted where we were. I don't know why I said it. He pulled it up. We were on the trail. Of course we were on the trail. The blue dot sat right on the line. I looked at the cairn, then I looked past it, up the trail. And there, maybe 60 meters ahead, I could see another one. "How many do you think there are?" he asked. I didn't answer because I didn't want to think about the answer. What I was thinking about, instead, was the construction. The deliberateness of it. Each cairn we'd passed had been built with flat stones that were sourced locally. This section of the AT runs over a lot of exposed sandstone, plenty of flat material. But the stacking showed an understanding of balance and weight distribution that isn't random. Someone had done this before. Someone knew how. And more than that, the largest cairns, the ones that came up to my waist and chest, would have taken 20 minutes each to build safely. We'd covered maybe 2 miles of trail that was dense with them, each more elaborate than the last. The math on that, the time, the materials, the repeated trips back and forth, implied either a group of people working over multiple days or one person who had been doing this for a very long time. We went around the chest-height one and kept moving. That was a mistake. I know that now. At the time, going around felt like the rational choice. We're on the trail. We stay on the trail. We don't let stacked rocks change our behavior. Looking back, I think we should have turned around at the chest-height cairn. I think that was the point where something in my body knew, and I overrode it with my brain. The trail bent left around mile 4.5 and dropped into a shallow ravine. A section I remembered from the map. A low point before the final push toward the knob. In the ravine, the light was different. Less of it. The canopy closed in from both sides, and the leaf cover on the ground was undisturbed, which was the first thing that felt genuinely wrong in a way I couldn't rationalize. Undisturbed leaves meant nobody had walked this section recently. But we were following cairns. I stopped walking. He was 3 steps ahead of me before he noticed. He turned around. "The leaves," I said. He looked down. Looked back up at the trail. Looked at me. We had been following something that was leading us off the trail. Not dramatically. Not a sharp turn into the woods. But gradually, over the course of 2 miles, degree by degree, the way you move a compass needle slowly enough that the person holding it doesn't notice the heading has changed. I pulled out the paper map and stood there in that ravine, comparing the line of the trail ahead of us to the line on the paper, and they didn't match. They didn't match by about 40 degrees. "We're off trail," I said. He took the map, looked at it. Looked at the GPS, which still showed us on the trail line, because GPS accuracy in heavy canopy is plus or minus 15 meters, and a 40-degree deviation over 2 miles is subtle enough to stay inside that margin of error. "How long?" he asked. "Mile, maybe more." He handed the map back. "So we go back?" "Yeah," I said. "We go back." We turned around. The first cairn we passed going the other direction was the chest-height one. Still there. We went around it. Then the next, and we were moving faster now. Not running, but not dawdling either. And somewhere around what I thought was cairn number 12 going backwards, I looked ahead and saw another one, ahead of us, in the direction we'd come from. In a spot I was certain had been empty when we'd walked through it 20 minutes before. I grabbed his sleeve and stopped him. "Was that there before?" He looked at it, looked at me. "I don't. I think so. It wasn't." He didn't argue. He looked at the cairn for a long moment, and then he looked at the trees on both sides of the trail, and then he looked back at me. We didn't discuss it. We just started walking faster. We made it back to the trailhead in just under an hour. We didn't talk much on the way out. At one point, I thought I heard movement in the trees parallel to the trail. A rhythmic sound, like footsteps keeping pace. But when I stopped, it stopped. And I told myself it was a deer and kept moving. Back at the car, we sat in the parking lot for a while, with the heat running. I've looked for explanations since then. Trail maintenance groups sometimes mark reroutes with cairns, but the AT Conservancy uses specific orange blazes for reroutes, not stone stacks. Some people theorize about land navigation training exercises using cairn systems. But that doesn't explain the placement or the scale. I posted about it on 2 AT hiking forums and got a handful of responses, mostly dismissive. One from a woman who said she'd hiked that same section 6 months earlier and seen nothing unusual. The one response I kept thinking about came from a username I can't find anymore. It said, "The ones that appear behind you aren't meant to show you where to go. They're meant to show you that someone knows where you've been." I flagged the comment to respond to it. When I came back to the thread, the account was deleted. The comment was gone, but I'd already read it. And the thing about words like that is that once they're in your head, in the specific context that makes them land correctly, they don't come back out. They just sit there. They're sitting there right now. The truck was a 2019 Ford F-250, and we'd saved for 2 years to build the rooftop setup. That detail matters because the platform was solid. 12-gauge steel mounting brackets, a Thule Tepui Atana tent rated for 4-season use, a ladder that locked into place, with a satisfying mechanical click that I'd tested, probably 100 times in the driveway before we ever took it anywhere. When you spend that kind of money and that kind of time building something, right, you develop a specific confidence in it, not arrogance. Just the quiet certainty that comes from knowing every bolt and every seam and every stress point personally. That truck and that tent were the most thoroughly understood things in my life. Which is why what happened on the third night in Ocala mattered in a way it wouldn't have if we'd been in a ground tent. We'd driven down to the Ocala National Forest in Central Florida in early November, a Thursday to Sunday trip. No particular agenda beyond disconnecting. My partner handled the route and the reservations. I handled the gear. We'd been doing this division of labor for 3 years of camping together, and it worked the way good systems work, which is to say we never thought about it anymore. It was just how things got done. The first 2 nights were exactly what we came for. We were at a primitive, dispersed site off a forest road that didn't have a posted number, just a cleared pull-off wide enough for the truck, and a ring of old fire ash that told us others had been here before. No hookups, no amenities, no neighbors. The nearest campground with actual facilities was 8 miles east. Out here, it was just scrub oak and sand pine, and the particular Florida darkness that feels thicker than darkness elsewhere, maybe because of the humidity, maybe because the tree canopy absorbs the sky in a way that leaves you with no horizon reference at all. We slept well the first 2 nights. That matters too. I want to be clear that nothing felt wrong going in. We weren't uneasy. We weren't primed for anything. We went to bed on Saturday night, full from a camp-cooked meal of sausage and peppers, slightly sunburned, tired in the good muscle-tired way that outdoor days produce. I climbed the ladder, zipped the tent, checked the door once out of habit, and was asleep before 10. I woke at 2:07 a.m. I know the time, because the first thing I did when my eyes opened was check my phone, which was face down on the tent floor next to my head. The screen lit up when I picked it up. 2:07. I lay still for a moment, trying to identify what had woken me. This is something I've trained myself to do. Not move first, listen first. My partner was still asleep beside me, breathing slow and even. The forest was quiet, not the absence of sound quiet you get in a city when the traffic dies down. The actual quiet of a place that generates its own sounds, insects and small movements, and the occasional distant bird, all of it present and normal and undisturbing. Nothing had changed in the audio environment. Nothing had triggered any conscious alarm. I put my phone down and closed my eyes. The first knock came 11 seconds later. I counted because I'd just picked my phone back up to check if I'd gotten a notification. Something, anything that might explain why I was awake. And I was watching the seconds on the clock when the sound came. A single knock. Not a branch falling, not the tick of cooling metal, not an animal brushing the side panel. A knock. The kind a human hand makes on a hollow surface when the intent is to be heard. It came from the driver's side rear quarter panel. Low on the body, below the bed rails. I sat up. My partner didn't wake. The knock had been, and I've thought about this a lot, precisely loud enough to wake a light sleeper without being loud enough to wake someone deeper under, which is a strange calibration for an accidental sound to achieve. I noted that and filed it and told myself, animal. Probably a raccoon investigating the truck. We had a cooler in the bed, locked, but the smell doesn't care about locks. I sat in the dark tent and listened. 40 seconds of nothing. 50. A minute, the second knock came, same location, same force, identical in every way to the first one, except that it was the second one, which meant it wasn't random, which meant my raccoon theory required the raccoon to have a sense of rhythm and an understanding of pause for effect. I was fully awake now in the specific way that fear wakes you. Not groggily, not gradually, but all at once. Every system online simultaneously, the way a circuit breaker trips. And suddenly everything is either on or off, with nothing in between. I reached over and put my hand on my partner's shoulder without shaking it. Just contact. Grounding myself, the third knock came, same spot, same force. And then, nothing. Complete silence for what felt like 3 full minutes, but was probably 45 seconds. And then, from directly below us, from the bed of the truck, came the sound of the cooler latch, not the cooler opening, the latch. The specific mechanical sound of the two-handed over-center clasp on a Pelican 50 quart being manipulated by someone who understood how it worked. It's not an intuitive mechanism. There's a specific sequence, both handles simultaneously, then lift. You don't figure that out by accident in the dark. You figure it out because you've used one before. My partner was awake. I don't know exactly when. I felt the change in their breathing before they moved. We lay still and did not speak and listened to whoever was standing in the bed of our truck work the cooler latch in the dark. The latch opened. The seal broke with a soft pop of pressurized air, then silence. We didn't move. I am not ashamed of this. There is a version of this story where I unzip the tent and look over the edge of the platform and confront whatever is down there, and that version of the story requires me to be a different person than I am, or to be stupid, which amounts to the same thing. We were 8 feet off the ground in a tent, with one exit and one ladder, and whoever was below us knew we were there because they had knocked, and I was not going to show them my face. We lay still for 4 minutes. I know because I watched my phone clock. No further sound from the bed. No footsteps on the sand, or none that I could hear, which in Florida sand is not the same as no footsteps, because dry sand absorbs sound the way it absorbs everything else. No voices, no light through the tent fabric. Nothing. At 6 minutes I heard what might have been a footstep, a single compression of dry brush, maybe 15 meters from the truck, in the direction of the tree line. Then nothing again. At 2:31 a.m., I unzipped the tent fly 1 inch and looked out. The clearing was empty. The fire was dead ash. The tree line was dark and flat and gave up nothing. I looked down at the truck bed. The cooler was open. The lid was resting against the side of the bed at a 45-degree angle, the way it falls when you open it and lean it back without thinking. The food inside. The sausage in its vacuum pack, the leftover peppers in a container, 2 cans of sparkling water, a Ziploc of trail mix was untouched. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been moved. Whatever opened that cooler didn't want what was in it. I've thought about that for a long time. The taking nothing part. Raccoons and bears open coolers because they want the food. It's pure transactional behavior, stimulus, and reward. A person who opens a cooler in the dark and takes nothing either opened it by mistake or opened it to demonstrate that they could. We left at first light without making coffee. I drove us to a gas station 12 miles south, and we sat in the parking lot for an hour, and neither of us wanted to say what we were both thinking, so we didn't. We filed a report with the National Forest Ranger Station before we got on the highway home. The ranger who took the report asked if we'd seen anyone in the area during the day. We hadn't. She wrote something down and thanked us and said they'd look into it. I re-examined the truck at home in daylight. On the driver's side rear quarter panel, low on the body below the bed rails, in the exact location the knocks had come from, there were 3 marks in the road dust that had accumulated on the paint. Not scratches, pressure marks. The kind a knuckle leaves, 3 of them, evenly spaced. We haven't taken the rooftop setup out since then. The tent is still mounted. The ladder still locks with that same mechanical click I used to find reassuring. I still know every bolt and every seam. I just don't trust what's underneath anymore. 19 trips into the backcountry, and I had never once lost track of time. That sounds like the kind of someone says to establish credibility before admitting they did something careless. So let me be more specific. I don't mean I was punctual. I mean that time, the tracking of it, the awareness of light and position, and the relationship between the two. Had I become so automatic over 11 years of solo backpacking that it functioned the way breathing functions, below the level of conscious thought. A background process that never dropped a packet. I'd hiked the Appalachian Trail twice. I'd done the John Muir Trail alone in 17 days. I'd spent a week above treeline in the Wind River Range in Wyoming, in conditions that turned 3 other parties around, and didn't turn me. I am not telling you this to impress you. I am telling you so that when I describe what happened on the 4th night of my Smokies trip, that the person it happened to was not careless, was not inexperienced, was not the kind of hiker who makes the mistakes that end up on search and rescue reports. I was camped at a backcountry site called Derrick Knob, shelter number 17 on the AT through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Elevation just under 5,000 feet. It sits in a small clearing on the western end of a long ridge, surrounded by old-growth spruce and fir that are dense enough to cut the wind, but open enough at the shelter itself that you get a clean sky view directly overhead. I'd been there twice before and knew the site well. I set up my bivvy 30 feet from the shelter itself. I prefer the bivvy to the communal shelters when I'm solo, always have, and ate dinner at the picnic table while the light went out of the sky. The date was the 3rd of October. Sunset at that latitude and elevation comes around 6:50. I noted it the way I always note it, not by checking anything, just by registering the shift in ambient light quality the way you'd register a door closing somewhere in the house. I cleaned my pot, hung my food bag on the bear cable, brushed my teeth with water from my filter bottle, and got into the bivvy. I remember lying there for a while, watching the spruce tops move against the stars. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s. My enlightened equipment quilt was more than adequate, and I was warm and comfortable, and the sound the wind made in the fir boughs above me was the kind of sound that costs nothing and is worth everything. I noted the time before I closed my eyes. 9:14 p.m. I want to be precise about what I experience next because precision is the only tool I have. I did not feel myself fall asleep. There was no hypnagogic drift, no slow dissolution of awareness. One moment I was watching the stars through the mesh of the bivvy, and the next moment I was looking at the same sky, and the light was wrong, not dark wrong, bright wrong. The sun was high and slightly west of vertical. Early afternoon light, the specific quality of October light in the southern Appalachians at high elevation, which I know as well as I know anything, which has a color temperature and an angle and a texture that is completely unmistakable and completely impossible at 9:15 at night. I lay still for several seconds. This is not something I planned. My body simply didn't move. The way your body sometimes refuses to act on information that your brain hasn't finished processing. I looked at the angle of the light through the mesh of the bivvy. I looked at the shadows it was throwing across the clearing. Short shadows, high sun shadows, early to mid-afternoon shadows. Then I reached for my phone. The screen lit up. I stared at it for long enough that it went dark, and I had to wake it again. 1:06 p.m. October 4th. I had gone to sleep at 9:14 p.m. on October 3rd. I was looking at 1:06 p.m. on October 4th, 16 hours. Not 14. I've said 14 in the way you compress details when you're trying to explain something that resists explanation, but the actual number was closer to 16. 16 hours I cannot account for in any way that satisfies me. I sat up in the bivvy and conducted the kind of immediate self-inventory that backcountry training drills into you. Was I injured? No. Was I disoriented beyond the time anomaly itself? No. I knew exactly where I was, could have drawn the site from memory, felt spatially grounded in a way that was completely at odds with what the clock was telling me. Was I hungry? Yes, significantly. The kind of deep muscle hunger that follows genuine, prolonged fasting, not just a missed meal. Was I thirsty? Yes, the same quality. My body had been without food and water for the duration of whatever had happened. I got out of the bivvy. The first thing I noticed was my boots. I'd left them outside the bivvy foot end, the way I always do, unlaced, tongue folded down, heels together. That's not a casual habit. That's a specific arrangement I've used on every trip for 8 years, because it means the boots are ready to step into, fast in the dark if I need to move quickly. They were still outside the bivvy. That's to sound outside the tree to bivvy. They were laced. Not the way I lace them. I use a surgeon's knot at the ankle. Before continuing to the top, a specific technique I picked up from a mountaineering course in 2016 that creates a pressure point that prevents heel lift on descents. The boots in front of me were laced straight across, loop to loop, the standard technique, tied with a double bow that I don't use. I stood in the clearing and looked at my boots for a long time. The bivvy itself was zipped closed. I never sleep with it zipped. I run warm enough that even in the low 40s, I keep the mesh panel open for airflow. It was zipped from the outside. I want to be careful here about the difference between what I observed and what I concluded. I observed a 16-hour gap, boots laced by different hands, a bivvy zipped from outside, a body that had been without food and water long enough to register genuine physiological deficit. I concluded nothing. I am still concluding nothing, 8 months later, because the gap between the observations and any explanation I can construct is too wide to bridge honestly. What I did was methodical. I checked the bear cable. Food bag still there, undisturbed. I checked the shelter register, which is a notebook in a Ziploc bag that hikers sign when they pass through. The last entry before mine, from the previous afternoon, was from a southbound thru hiker with a trail name I won't repeat here out of respect for their privacy. No entries after mine from the previous evening. No entries from anyone passing through during the 16 hours I was absent from my own experience. I was alone on that ridge for the duration. 8. As far as the register knew, I ate, drank a liter of filtered water, and packed out. Not because I was frightened, or not only because of that, because I am a systematic person, and the system I had was broken, and when the system is broken, you go back to the trailhead and you figure out why from a position of safety. I made the trailhead by 4 p.m., which put my pace well within normal range, which meant my legs were fine, which meant I had not walked anywhere during those 16 hours, or I had walked somewhere and come back, and my legs had recovered, and I had no memory of either. I saw a doctor the following week, told her I'd had an episode of what I described as time loss during a camping trip. Woke up significantly later than I'd fallen asleep, possibly 16 hours. She asked about alcohol, which I don't use on solo trips. She asked about medications, which I take none. She ordered blood work and an EEG and a follow-up with a neurologist, all of which came back clean. No seizure activity, no metabolic irregularity, no carbon monoxide, which she raised as a possibility, though I'd been sleeping outdoors with no enclosed structure to trap gas. Nothing. The neurologist used the phrase idiopathic episode, which is medical language for, we see that something happened, and we cannot tell you what it was. She said dissociative episodes were possible, particularly under conditions of physical exertion and isolation. She said sleep phase disorders could occasionally produce the subjective experience of time loss. She said both of these things in the calm, measured way of someone who is offering frameworks rather than answers. She didn't mention the boots. I didn't either, because there is no medical framework for boots. I've been back into the back country 4 times since October. Shorter trips, different ranges, always with at least one other person. Before I sleep, I photograph my boots and my bivvy closure and the time on my phone. I have the photos on a specific album I've titled, with the kind of dark practicality that solo hikers develop. Baseline. Every morning so far, the baseline has matched. I don't know if that means things are fine. I don't know if whatever happened on that ridge was a one-time event or an introduction. I don't know if the 16 hours were empty or full. I don't know if I was alone. What I know is that I take the photos every night now without thinking about it, the way you check the stove before you leave the house, the way you tap your pocket for your keys. Automatic. Below the level of conscious thought. A background process that runs whether I want it to or not. The thing that still doesn't make sense is the boots, not where my brother ended up. Not the 11 miles, not the bare feet, not the timeline that doesn't work, no matter how many times I run the numbers. Those things are strange enough. But it's the boots that come back to me at 2 in the morning when I can't sleep, because the boots had a specific logic to them that the rest of it didn't, and logic. Even wrong logic, even logic that leads somewhere I don't want to go, is harder to dismiss than strangeness. Let me back up. We were at a Boy Scout camp in the Coast Range outside Tillamook, Oregon, a permanent facility with cabins and a dining hall and a ropes course, the kind of place that runs summer programs for kids and rents to troops in the off-season for weekend campouts. October, 2nd weekend. 12 scouts, 3 adult leaders, and me 17 years old, my brother's senior patrol leader, which mostly meant I carried extra first aid supplies and pretended to know things I didn't when the younger kids asked questions. My brother was 13. He'd been in the troop for 2 years and was the kind of kid who took scouting seriously in a way that most 13-year-olds don't. Not in a rigid or performative way, but genuinely. He knew his knots. He could start a fire in wet conditions. He'd read the field book cover to cover twice and dog-eared the navigation section. If there was a kid on that trip least likely to wander off alone at night and get lost, it was him. Which is why what happened doesn't fit. Friday night was normal in every way. We set up in the main cabin. 12 sleeping bags in 2 rows. The particular sound of a dozen kids who aren't tired pretending to go to sleep. Someone's phone, playing music quietly until one of the leaders said something. I fell asleep around 11. My brother was in the bag next to mine. I remember because he'd complained about the foam pad being too thin, and I'd given him the extra closed cell pad I'd brought, and he'd said thanks in the perfunctory way of younger siblings accepting help from older ones. I woke up at 6:15 because the light through the cabin windows was that flat gray pre-dawn that has always woken me, even as a kid. I lay there for a moment doing the half-awake inventory of the room. The shapes of sleeping bags, the sound of breathing, the smell of 12 people and gear and old wood that every scout cabin smells like. His sleeping bag was empty. Not just unoccupied. Empty in the way that told me he'd been out of it for a while. When you sleep in a bag long enough, it holds your shape, holds some of your warmth. His was flat and cold and showed nothing. I shook the leader in the next bunk. He woke fast. Experienced outdoorsmen tend to. And we did a quick count and confirmed it was only my brother missing. And then we woke everyone and started the search pattern we'd been trained for. Systematic, expanding radius from the cabin, calling his name. The other leader radioed the camp host. We searched for 40 minutes before the camp host's phone rang. A county sheriff's deputy had found my brother sitting on a boulder at a trailhead pullout on Highway 6, which runs along the Wilson River about 11 miles from the camp. The deputy had spotted him in the early morning light while driving the highway. A kid sitting alone on a rock at the edge of the road at 6:40 in the morning, wearing scout pants and a thermal undershirt and nothing else. No jacket, no shoes. Sitting with his hands in his lap, looking at the river, he was physically unharmed. No cuts on his feet, which was the first thing the deputy checked, and the first thing that didn't make sense, because 11 miles of Oregon coast range terrain in October. The trails, the road shoulder, the underbrush, does not leave bare feet unmarked. The deputy assumed he'd been in a vehicle, that someone had dropped him there. He asked my brother how he'd gotten to the highway. My brother said he didn't know. He said it the way you say something that is simply true. Not confused, not evasive. Just, I don't know. He remembered going to sleep in the cabin. He remembered the foam pad, the thin one, and that his sleeping bag zipper was sticky on the left side. He remembered nothing after that until he was sitting on the boulder, watching the river, and the headlights of the deputy's car swung across him. Salsa. The leader picked him up and brought him back. There was a conversation with the sheriff's department, calls to our parents, a trip to urgent care in Tillamook, where they checked him over and found nothing physically wrong. No signs of exposure despite being underdressed for the temperature. No injuries. Blood work normal. The doctor used the word somnambulism, which is the clinical word for sleepwalking, and said it occurred more commonly in adolescence than most people realized, particularly under conditions of disrupted sleep or mild stress. 11 miles of mountain terrain, barefoot, with no physical evidence of the journey. I didn't say that to the doctor. I didn't think it would help. Here is what I haven't told anyone except one person, and that person is my brother, who listened and then was quiet for a long time, and then said he believed me but wished I hadn't told him. When I came back into the cabin after the search started, I'd gone back to grab my jacket and the first aid kit, I noticed his boots were gone from beside his sleeping bag. This was normal. This was what made us initially think he'd left voluntarily, that he'd put his shoes on and gone to the bathroom or something. Boots missing meant he'd walked out under his own power, consciously. The deputy found him barefoot. So, where were the boots? We searched the cabin after we got back. We searched the immediate area around the cabin, the path to the bathrooms, the surrounding tree line. Nothing. A scout leader did a full sweep of the grounds before we packed out Sunday afternoon. His boots were not on the camp property, except, and this is the part I've turned over so many times that the edges have gone soft. When I went to roll up my foam sleeping pad, the one I'd lent him, I found them under my pad, placed there, not accidentally kicked under, not shoved out of the way in the night, placed with the same deliberateness you'd place something you wanted to keep safe or hidden or somewhere specific. Toes pointed toward the wall, heels together, side by side. The laces were tucked inside the boots rather than left hanging, which is not how my brother stored his boots, and not how any 13-year-old I've ever known stores his boots. He was asleep in the bag next to mine. If he placed those boots under my pad, he did it while I was there, in the dark, without waking me. And then he left the cabin barefoot and walked, or was walked, 11 miles to a highway in the dark and sat on a boulder until a deputy's headlights found him. Or he never placed the boots at all. I've never found a framework that holds all of it. The somnambulism explanation covers the walking. Maybe if you granted a range and a physical resilience that strains the literature, it doesn't cover the boots. Nothing covers the boots because the boots require intent, require a decision, made in the dark, to put them somewhere specific. And intent is incompatible with unconscious movement. You can sleepwalk. You cannot sleepwalk. And also make a deliberate choice about where to leave your shoes, unless someone else made that choice. That's the thought I don't finish. I've started it 100 times, and each time I reach the same point and stop, not because I'm afraid of where it goes, but because where it goes requires accepting something out that night that I don't have the evidence to accept and don't have the evidence to dismiss. And I've found that living in that particular gap is something you can do, just not comfortably and not without cost. My brother is 21 now. He doesn't camp. He's never said explicitly that what happened is the reason. And I've never asked directly, because there are questions between siblings that both people understand are not really questions. They're just ways of opening a door that neither person actually wants to walk through. He still doesn't remember anything between the sleeping bag and the boulder. Some gaps don't fill in. You wait for them to, and they don't, and eventually you'll just stop waiting and just build your life around the shape of the missing piece, the way a tree grows around a wound. It becomes part of the structure. You can't remove it without taking down the whole thing. The boots are in a box in my closet. I don't know why I kept them. I've moved twice since then, and I've taken them both times without making a conscious decision to do so. They just end up in the moving boxes, the way objects do, when you can't figure out what category they belong to. I should probably get rid of them. I haven't. The second fire appeared on the third night, and by then I was already the kind of tired that makes you doubt your own competence. That context matters. I want to put it on the table first, because I've spent a long time since then trying to determine how much of what I experienced was the situation and how much was me. The particular version of me that existed on that specific night. After 60 hours of solo wilderness and straw work, after 2 days of paddling in conditions that were harder than the forecast suggested after the kind of accumulated physical depletion that doesn't show up as sleepiness so much as a subtle wrongness in your perception, a half-step lag between the world and your processing of it. I've been a wilderness guide for 9 years. I hold a swift water rescue certification, a wilderness first responder credential, and I've led solo retreats in the Boundary Waters, Canoe, Area Wilderness in northern Minnesota every season since I was 26. I know that environment the way most people know their own neighborhood, the way the light moves across the water at different hours, the way the wind patterns shift when weather is building from the northwest. The particular silence of a lake that has gone completely calm in the hour before dark. It is not a place that surprises me easily, which is why I am still thinking about the fire. The retreat I was running that week was a solo leadership program, the kind where participants are dropped at individual campsites around a lake system and spend 4 days alone with minimal gear as a structured introspective exercise. My role was to paddle a circuit of the lake each morning and evening, doing welfare checks at each site without making extended contact. The participants weren't in distress. They were in process. My job was to be present and invisible at the same time. My own campsite was on the north shore of the largest lake in the system, a granite shelf site that I'd used as a base camp for 3 seasons, elevated enough above the waterline to give a clear sightline across the lake's full width, which was roughly half a mile at that point. I could see the opposite shore clearly in good light and as a dim mass after dark. I knew every feature of that shoreline, the gap in the tree line where a beaver pond drained into the lake, the pale granite dome that caught the last light. In the evening, the small bay at the western end where the water shallowed over a sand bottom and turned a different color in afternoon sun. I also knew there were no campsites on the south shore. This is not incidental. The Boundary Waters operates under a strict permit system, with designated campsites marked on the official map. I held the permit for this lake system for the week. The South Shore had no designated sites. It was a stretch of dense black spruce and tamarack bog that ran unbroken for about 2 miles, difficult to access by water because of the shallow approach, and impossible to camp on even if you reached it, because the ground was wet sphagnum moss over standing water. I had paddled that shore dozens of times. Nobody camped there. The first 2 nights I was on the lake, the South Shore was dark after sunset. This was correct. This was how it always was. On the 3rd night, I built my fire at the usual time, around 8. After dinner, more for the ritual of it than for warmth, because October in the Boundary Waters means you're already in your insulating layers by that hour, and the fire is mostly psychological. I sat with my back against a lichen-covered granite slab and drank tea and watched the lake go dark and ran through the next morning's circuit in my head. I saw the light at 8:47. I know because I'd just checked my Garmin InReach, the satellite communicator I carry on every trip, to confirm a check-in message from the program coordinator had gone through. The screen read 8:47 when I looked up. On the South Shore, directly opposite my position, there was a fire. I sat very still. The way you sit when your body has processed information that your mind is still catching up to. It was the right size for a campfire, not a wildfire, not a signal fire, not a lamp or a headlamp. The warm, contained, slightly variable light of burning wood. It moved the way fire moves, with that organic, non-mechanical flicker that no artificial light has ever successfully replicated. It was, in every visual characteristic, a normal campfire, burning on a shoreline that did not have campsites, and where normal campfires did not burn. My first response was practical. Someone had come in without a permit. It happened occasionally, though less often since enforcement improved, or someone was in distress and had built a signal fire on the nearest available shore. I stood up and got my binoculars from the dry bag. Through the binoculars, the fire was simply more fire. No tent visible, though in the dark and at that distance I wouldn't necessarily expect to see one. No watercraft on the shore, no canoe pulled up, no kayak. The fire sat at the water's edge in the way that only a fire built deliberately at the water's edge sits, the reflection on the flat lake surface, doubling it into a vertical mirror image below the real thing. I looked at my own fire. Then back across the lake. The two fires were the same size. I'm aware that this could be coincidence, that campfires tend toward a certain size range determined by available fuel and the habits of experienced builders. But the match was precise in a way that coincidence usually isn't. Same height, same width, same color temperature, same behavior. If I had held a piece of paper between my eye and my fire and described it, and then turned and described the fire across the lake, the descriptions would have been identical. I made the decision to paddle over. This was operationally appropriate. If someone was on that shore without authorization or in need of assistance, my response obligation was clear. I got my PFD, my headlamp, my inReach, and my paddle, and launched the canoe from the granite shelf into water that had gone black and perfectly flat in the calm evening air. The paddle across took about 15 minutes at a moderate pace. Flat water, no wind, good visibility from a 3/4 moon. I watched the fire the entire way. It burned steadily. It did not respond to my approach. No figures moved around it. No voices called out. No light swept the water in my direction. At roughly 200 meters from the south shore, I noticed something and stopped paddling. My fire was getting smaller. I turned and looked back at my campsite on the north shore. The fire I'd left burning. A solid hardwood fire built on a granite base, nowhere near burnout, had reduced by half. I could see the glow of it, but it was visibly diminished, the way a fire looks in its last 20 minutes when the main fuel has gone to coals. It had been a full, healthy fire when I launched. 15 minutes of unattended burning doesn't do that to a hardwood fire. I turned back toward the south shore. The fire there had reduced by exactly the same amount. I floated in the middle of the lake and watched both fires in the same field of view, and understood that what I was looking at was not fires behaving independently. Whatever was happening with one was happening with the other. The sizes matched, the reduction matched, the timing matched. They were coupled in some way I had no framework for. I started paddling toward the south shore again. The fires kept shrinking. By the time I was 50 meters out, they were both down to low red cores, barely above ember stage. At 25 meters, I could feel the approach of the south shore. The water was shallowing, the pale sand bottom appearing under my hull, and both fires were nearly out. At 10 meters, the fire on the south shore went dark. I looked back at my camp. My fire was gone too. I sat in the canoe in the shallows of a shore that doesn't have campsites and cannot be camped on, and shone my headlamp at the place where the fire had been. The beam crossed black spruce, sphagnum moss, standing water, tamarack roots. No fire pit, no ash, no scorched ground, no disturbed earth of any kind. No footprints in the soft moss, no sign that anything had been there at all. I paddled back across the lake. My fire pit held the orange glow of recently active coals, dying back to gray in the way a real fire does when it reaches the end of its fuel. The fire had burned itself out naturally in the time I'd been gone. This was normal. This was exactly what a real fire does. I sat beside the cooling pit for a long time and did not rebuild it. I've told this story to 2 people, Both experienced wilderness guides. Both people I trust to apply rigorous skepticism rather than easy mysticism. One suggested bioluminescence combined with fatigue-induced misperception, which doesn't hold up geometrically. The other said nothing for a long time and then said, the boundary waters does things to perception that she's never been able to fully categorize, and she's stopped trying. I've led 4 retreats on that lake system since then. Every night I sit with my fire and watch the South Shore. It's been dark every time. I keep watching anyway, because the thing about seeing something you cannot explain is that it doesn't unhappen when the explanation fails to arrive. And it just sits there in the category of things you witnessed but cannot account for, taking up space, resisting the filing system. The South Shore stays dark. I keep watching. The trail was one I had walked 11 times. Not approximately 11. Exactly 11. I keep a log, have kept one since my oldest was in diapers. A water-damaged spiral notebook in the glove compartment of my truck, where I record every trail, every date, every notable condition. 11 entries for the Cosby Creek route in the Cherokee National Forest. The last one dated 14 months before the trip I'm about to describe. I knew that trail the way you know a road you've driven to work for years. Not consciously, not with active attention, but in the body. The places where the grade steepened. The creek crossing at mile 2, where the stepping stones shifted every season. The long flat section through the hemlock stand where the light went green and strange, even at midday. I was leading a crew of 9 boys, ages 11 to 14, on a 2-night backpacking trip as part of an advancement requirement. 3 of them were working toward their eagle. The other 6 were along because their parents had signed the permission slips and paid the fee, and in some cases, I suspected, because the weekend offered a specific kind of household relief that parents of adolescent boys learn to appreciate. I had done this trip, or versions of it, 7 times before with different groups. I was not cavalier about it. I was also not worried. My co-leader had canceled 48 hours before departure. A family situation, legitimate, nothing to be done about it. I'd considered postponing and decided against it. 9 boys, familiar trail, 2 nights, nothing technical. I'd handled larger groups solo before. I logged the solo status with the troop committee and filed the trip plan with the Forest Service, and we left Saturday morning in 2 vehicles with gear that I had personally checked. The first day was the kind of day that makes you remember why you do this work. Cool enough to move comfortably under pack weight, warm enough that nobody was miserable. The boys were loud and funny and full of the specific energy of young people released from structures they spend most of their lives inside. We made camp at the designated backcountry site at mile 4x2 in the afternoon, set up, filtered water, and I ran a fire building session that devolved predictably into a competition that I allowed, because competition, properly channeled, produces results. That night around the fire, one of the older boys asked me if I'd ever been actually scared in the woods. Nesu. Not the standard campfire story scared. He meant genuinely, physically frightened in a way that changed how he thought about being out here. I told him I'd had moments of concern, but nothing I'd categorize as fear. 26 hours later, I understood why that was a premature answer. Sunday, we broke camp after breakfast and continued up the trail for what I'd planned as a 6-mile loop that would bring us back to the trailhead via a different route. A longer, higher path that offered better views and, more practically, gave the Eagle candidates the mileage requirement they needed. I'd done this loop twice before. It was straightforward. We were about 2 miles into the loop section, somewhere past the ridgeline, when the trail intersected what appeared to be an unmarked side path heading north into the forest. I say appeared because the word path implies a level of formality it didn't quite deserve. It was more of a persistent absence of undergrowth, a line through the vegetation where things simply didn't grow, wide enough for a person to walk single file. It wasn't on my map. I have a USGS topo for that area that I've used for 11 years and have marked up with personal notations. And there was nothing at that grid coordinate indicating a trail, a fire road, a utility line, or any other linear feature. I would have walked past it. I was walking past it. The boy directly behind me, the one who'd asked about fear the night before, stopped and said, "What's that?" I stopped and looked. The path went north into the trees for as far as I could see before the rain bent and took it out of sight line. Maybe 200 meters visible. The trees along it were mature hardwood, oak and hickory, 80-year growth, which meant this wasn't a new clearing. Whatever had kept that corridor open had been doing so for a long time. I told the boys to stay on the main trail and wait, and I walked 30 meters up the side path to see what I could see. What I saw at roughly 200 meters, through a gap in the trees where the path bent slightly east, was a roofline, low and dark, barely above the surrounding brush, the kind of profile a structure makes when it's been there long enough that the forest has grown up around and partially over it. I stood and looked at it for a moment. Then I went back to the boys. My intention was to continue on the main trail. That was the correct call. Unmarked structure in a remote area is not a scout leader's business, and I had 9 miners in my care on a schedule. We had 4 miles to the trailhead, and I wanted to be there before 4. The boy who'd spotted the path asked what was up there. I said a building, probably an old hunting cabin. Private property, we're moving on. He asked if we could look at it. I said no. He accepted this in the way that 14-year-olds accept directives from adults, which is to say with his mouth, but not his face. And we continued up the trail. I don't know why I went back. That's the part I've examined most carefully in the months since, because the decision to turn around and look doesn't fit the version of myself I think I am. I'm methodical. I complete the objective. I don't double back on impulse. But about a quarter mile past the turnoff, I stopped the group and told them to take a water break and stay together. And I walked back down the trail alone. The path was still there. I walked its full visible length to the bend and then around it. The structure was a cabin. Not old in the romantic, weathered pioneer sense. Old in the sense of prolonged habitation without maintenance, which is a different thing and produces a different feeling. The walls were rough-cut lumber, darkened with age and moisture. But the gaps between the boards had been chinked recently. I could see the pale, newer material against the dark wood, the kind of fill that goes in within the last year or two, not the last decade. The roof had a patched section near the ridge that used different material than the original, newer-looking, installed with competence, if not craft. Someone had been maintaining this structure. Someone was still maintaining it. There was no window on the side facing me. I moved around to what I took for the front. There was one window, small, covered from the inside, with what looked like a moving blanket. A door, solid wood, no handle on the outside, just a hasp with a padlock. The padlock was new, a master number 3, the kind you can find at any hardware store, steel shackle, no rust. I stood in front of that door for a moment. Then I looked down. The ground in front of the door was soft, partially shaded, and it held impressions well. There were boot prints, multiple sets, different sizes, the kind of accumulation that happens over time with regular use. And there were marks on the door itself, low down, near the bottom edge on the interior side. Except they weren't on the interior side. I was on the exterior. The marks I was seeing were on the outside face of the door, low, horizontal, irregular. I took a step closer. They were scratch marks. Deep ones, grouped in the frantic, overlapping pattern that fingernails make when someone is scratching at a surface with sustained, desperate force. Not tool marks. Not animal marks. I know what bare claws and rodent gnawing look like on wood, and this was neither. These were the marks of human hands from the outside of a door that was padlocked shut, scratching to get in, or scratching to get out. I stood there and worked through it, and arrived at the same conclusion from every angle. The padlock was on the outside. If you were inside and wanted out, you could not reach the padlock. If you were outside and something had put those scratch marks there, you had been locked out of a structure you desperately wanted to enter, which made no sense. The only configuration that produced those marks in that location from a human hand was a person inside a locked space, scratching at the only surface they could reach, the door locked from the outside. The scratches were on the outside. I have no explanation for that. I've built enough structures and operated enough latching hardware to know that I'm reading the geometry correctly. The scratches are where they shouldn't be if the person made them from inside. They are exactly where they should be if the person made them from inside. And the door opened the wrong way, outward, toward them, with the lock on the face that becomes the interior when the door swings, a door hinged to open outward, padlocked from the outside, with scratch marks on the face that is inside when the door is closed. Someone had been locked inside. Someone had scratched at the only surface within reach. Someone had done it long enough and hard enough to leave marks that were still legible in the wood. I walked back to the boys at a pace I controlled carefully because 9 kids read adults the way animals read weather, and I did not want them to read what I was feeling. I told them water break was over. I set a pace that was faster than our morning average, and I held it for the remaining 4 miles, and we reached the trailhead at 3:47. Service. I called the Forest Service from the parking lot. I described the location as precisely as my topo and GPS could establish. The woman who took the call was professional and non-committal in the way of people who receive strange calls and have learned to triage before responding. She asked if I had observed any individuals in the area. I said no. She said they'd send someone to investigate and asked me not to return to the site. I haven't. I have no record of any follow-up, no report filed publicly, no news item that matches the location or the description. I checked for 3 months and found nothing. The Forest Service has not responded to my 2 follow-up inquiries. I filed the trip in my water-damaged notebook when I got home. Under notable conditions, I wrote 2 words and then stopped and looked at them for a long time. Then, I closed the notebook and put it back in the glove compartment and haven't opened it since. It was my idea to swim at night. I want to own that because the other 3 have never said it. Not once in the 2 years since. Not in the group chat that went quiet for 6 weeks after we got home. Not in the conversations we've had individually where we've each tried to process it in our own way. Nobody has said, "You suggested it." They wouldn't. That's the kind of friends they are. But I suggested it, and they agreed, and we went in. And what happened in that water is something I have not been able to leave behind, no matter how much distance I put between myself and that lake. We'd driven up to a lake in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, one of those water bodies that doesn't have a maintained access point or a name on consumer maps, the kind you find by following a logging road until it ends, and then walking another half-mile through second-growth birch and tag alder until the trees open up. And there it is. A friend of a friend had mentioned it 2 summers before. Dark water, cold, even in August. Good fishing if you had the patience for it. No other people, ever, apparently. That last part was the selling point for all 4 of us. We'd arrived Friday afternoon. 4 of us, I'll call us by the roles we filled, rather than names, because the names don't matter. There was me, the one who'd organized the trip, the one who'd driven, who owned the truck and the canoe strapped to its roof, the one who'd been skeptical about the whole thing until we got there, and then became its most enthusiastic convert the moment he saw the water, and the quiet one who had barely spoken for the first 3 hours. And then, once we'd set up camp and cracked the first round of drinks, became the funniest person there, as he always did, once the social warm-up period had run its course. The first 2 days were exactly what we'd come for. We fished in the mornings from the canoe, not catching much, not caring, and read and cooked and talked in the afternoons and evenings. The lake was everything the friend of a friend had promised. Dark and cold and absolutely private, the kind of place that makes you feel like the world has a back room that most people never find. There was no cell service, there was no sound that hadn't been there before humans arrived. It was the specific piece that I think some people go their whole lives without accessing, and we had it completely to ourselves. Saturday night, we sat by the fire later than we'd planned, and somewhere around midnight, the converted skeptic looked at the lake and said it was warm enough to swim. It was not warm enough to swim. It was August in the Upper Peninsula, which means the air was around 65, and the water, which is spring-fed and deep, was probably 55 at the surface and colder below. But there is a specific kind of late-night, outdoor logic that takes hold when you've been in a good place with good people for 2 days. And in that logic, cold water at midnight sounds not like a bad idea, but like exactly the right one. I said, let's do it. We left our clothes on the bank and waded in from the shallow gravel shelf at the north end of the lake. The cold was immediate and total, and the converted skeptic made a sound that sent the rest of us into the kind of laughter that is mostly just the release of tension. We swam out maybe 30 meters from shore, far enough that the water was clearly deep beneath us, the bottom no longer visible, just the cold, black depth of a lake that has been here since the glaciers. The moon was almost full. This matters because it meant the water surface had light on it. Not much, but enough. Enough to see the surface as a surface, to distinguish it from the sky above, to see the 4 of us as dark shapes moving against the faint silver of reflected moonlight. We'd been in the water maybe 10, maybe minutes when the driver stopped swimming. He went still in the way you go still, when your body registers something before your mind does. Treading water, barely moving, looking past the rest of us toward the south end of the lake. The south end was the deep end. The lake had a distinct gradient from the shallow gravel shelf at the north to what the friend of a friend had described as a significant depth at the south. Nobody had verified that number. At the time, it had seemed like the kind of detail that added to the appeal. I noticed him looking and turned. The south end of the lake was dark. This was normal. What was not normal was the surface disturbance I could see at the limit of my moonlight visibility. A movement in the water that wasn't wind-driven, because there was no wind. A long, slow displacement, the kind of wake a large submerged object makes when it moves close enough to the surface to disturb it without breaking through. Something was moving under the water toward us. Not fast. This is the detail I keep returning to because the speed of it was somehow more disturbing than if it had been fast. A fast approach could be a fish, a startled animal, something reflexive and uncontrolled. This was slow, and it was straight, and it had the quality of deliberate movement, of something that had chosen a direction and was maintaining it. It was large. I cannot give you a precise size, because size underwater in low light is impossible to accurately judge, and anyone who tells you differently is either lying or guessing. What I can tell you is that the displacement, the volume of water being moved, was inconsistent with anything I could identify. Not a northern pike, which is the largest fish you'd expect in a lake like this, and which tops out at a meter, maybe a meter and a half, in exceptional cases. This displacement suggested something significantly larger than that. Nobody spoke. I want to be clear about that. None of us said a word. We just converged. Without discussing it, without looking at each other, all four of us moved together into a tight group, the way prey animals do, and faced south and watched. The movement slowed as it reached the center of the lake, 30 meters from us, maybe a little more. It spread out as it slowed. The surface disturbance widening and flattening the way it does when something large reduces its speed and begins to hover in the water column rather than actively swim. It was below us. Below the surface, at whatever depth, in the dark water between us and the bottom, it circled. One full rotation, slow and wide, maybe a 40-meter diameter. The surface disturbance tracked it. We tracked the surface disturbance. I was aware of my legs hanging down into the dark water, and I was aware of this in a way that made me want to pull them up, to make myself smaller, to present less of a profile below the surface, which is a thought process I associate with a specific kind of fear that bypasses the rational and goes straight to something older. The circle completed and the movement stopped. 10 seconds. 15. The surface went flat in the way water goes flat when whatever was moving through it has gone still. No wind, no sound except the quiet one, whose breathing I could hear because he was right next to me, and because in that silence everything was audible. Then the movement came again, not circular this time. A straight line heading north, toward the shallow end, toward the gravel shelf where our clothes were, toward shore. We didn't discuss it. We moved. 4 adults swimming for shore with the kind of focused, non-panicked urgency that is more frightening to remember than outright panic would have been, because it meant we were all making the same calculation simultaneously and arriving at the same answer. We reached the shallows and walked out onto the gravel and stood there breathing. Behind us, maybe 30 meters out, the water broke, not dramatically, not a surge or a lunge, just a surface disturbance that for a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, had a shape, not a fin, not a head, a shape I cannot describe with precision, because it was dark and I was standing on a gravel shore with lake water running off me, and my eyes had still not fully adjusted from the submersion, but it was there, and it was above the surface, and it was large, and then it was gone. The water went flat. Nothing followed us to shore. Nothing moved in the shallows. We stood on the gravel for a long time and looked at the lake, and the lake gave nothing back. We built the fire back up and sat around it until 4 in the morning and talked about what it might have been. Sturgeon came up. Lake sturgeon can grow to significant sizes, and the Upper Peninsula has documented populations. Sturgeon made sense on paper. The size fit at the upper range. The behavior, the circling, the sustained surface proximity, that fit less well. Sturgeon are bottom feeders and generally avoid surface interaction with large groups of organisms. The driver, who had been the first to go still and the first to see it, said very little during this conversation. Near 4 a.m., when the conversation had wound down and we were sitting in the fire's diminishing light, he said one thing. He said the shape, when it surfaced, was not the shape of a fish. Nobody asked him what shape it was. We broke camp the next morning and were on the logging road before 9. The canoe went on the roof, the gear went in the truck, and we drove out without the specific discussion that would have acknowledged what we'd decided. That we weren't coming back. That the fishing trip was over. That whatever was in that water had not come at us and had not hurt us. And had by any rational measures simply been a large animal behaving like a large animal. None of that made me feel better about my legs. In the water, none of it makes me feel better now. The journal was wet but readable. That detail, readable, is the one that mattered, and I didn't understand why it mattered until later that night when I was sitting in my tent with the pages spread open across my sleeping bag, and the sick, slow certainty was building in me the way floodwater builds, quietly and then all at once. I found it on the Hoh River Trail in the Olympic Peninsula, Washington State. Late September, solo trip, 4 days out and back. I'd been planning this one for 8 months. The Hoh Rainforest is a specific kind of place, the kind that appears in the photographs of people who've been there and makes everyone who hasn't been there say they'll go someday, and most of them don't. I went. I'd taken 2 weeks off work, driven up from Portland, and started the trail at first light on a Tuesday with a pack that weighed 31 pounds and a forecast that promised 3 days of manageable drizzle before clearing. The Olympic Peninsula in late September means one thing above all else: wet. Not the dramatic, sheeting wet of a storm, but the ambient, pervasive wet of a rainforest ecosystem, doing what rainforest ecosystems do. Moisture hanging in the air, condensing on every surface, soaking into everything that isn't actively waterproofed, and some things that are. The trail itself was fine, well-maintained, the kind of path that serious hikers call a highway, because it's wide enough and clear enough that navigation requires almost no active thought. I'd done harder trails. I settled into the rhythm of it. I found the journal at mile 7. On the second day, it was sitting on top of a nurse log that ran parallel to the trail on the right side. One of those massive, fallen Sitka spruce that the rainforest produces, 8 feet in diameter at the base, completely covered in moss and fern, and the seedlings of its own successors. The journal was sitting on top of the log at roughly eye level, placed there, not thrown, not dropped, placed. Spine down, covers open around it like a tent, in the configuration you'd set a wet book to dry. It was a standard composition notebook. Black and white marbled cover, the kind that costs $1.49 at any drugstore. The cover had separated from the binding on one side from moisture, and the pages had swollen and warped in the way waterlogged paper does. But the ink, and this was the detail, this was the thing, the ink had not run. Whoever had written in it had used a Sharpie or something similar, a waterproof marker, and written with enough pressure that even the most saturated pages were legible. I stood and looked at it for a moment. The responsible thing would have been to take it to the ranger station at the trailhead on my way out. Lost property. Someone might want it back. I told myself that was my intention when I picked it up. Maybe it was. I'm not entirely sure now that the intention and the impulse were the same thing. I think part of me picked it up because it was a composition notebook in the middle of a rainforest, and I am constitutionally incapable of not being curious about that. I put it in the outer pocket of my pack and kept walking. I made camp at mile 9, which the trail map designated as a legitimate camping area near a gravel bar on the river. Set up my tent, a big Agnes copper spur, orange, visible from a distance, which I'd started specifying to people who asked about my gear after a conversation with a ranger who mentioned that color visibility had saved at least 2 searches in the past year. Cooked dinner, filtered water from the river, which ran clear and fast over the gravel, and made the kind of sound that makes you feel like the world is mostly fine. After dinner, I took the journal out. The entries were dated. This was the first thing I registered. Not the content, but the format. Because the writer had been consistent and deliberate about it, each entry headed with a month and day and a time. No year on any of them. I noted this and turned to the first entry and read. The handwriting was small and neat and slightly cramped in the way of someone who writes quickly and has learned to compress their letters for efficiency. I won't reproduce the entries directly. I don't have the journal anymore, and I'm not sure I could accurately quote it even if I did, because what happened when I read it made the specific language less important than the specific facts. The first entry described arriving at the Ho trailhead, early morning start. Pack weight, which the writer had listed as 29 pounds. Weather, drizzle, manageable. Forecast, 3 days of manageable drizzle before clearing. I read that sentence twice. The second entry described mile 4, a section of trail where a large cedar had come down across the path and been partially cut through by trail crew, leaving a triangular gap just wide enough to duck through with a pack. I had ducked through that exact gap 6 hours ago and noted it as a trail feature because it was recent. The cut wood was pale and fresh and smelled of resin. The third entry described the nurse log at mile 7. The writer had stopped there, had noted a good rest spot, the particular quality of the moss on the log's upper surface, the ferns growing from a crack near the center. I was sitting in my town ensigning reading a journal that someone had left on top of a nurse log at mile 7, and the journal described that nurse log from the perspective of someone who had stopped there, which meant the journal had been written before it was left there, which meant the writer had been ahead of me on this trail, which was completely normal and completely fine. Then I read the fourth entry. The fourth entry was dated the next morning. Tomorrow's date, a date that had not happened yet. I stopped. The entry was short. 3 sentences. It described a campsite, the writer's campsite, where the writer had slept. It described the gravel bar, the sound of the river, the orange tent visible from the trail, striking against the green of the forest. My tent was orange. The gravel bar was outside my tent door. I put the journal down on my sleeping bag and sat very still and did the thing I'd been doing my whole adult life when confronted with information that resisted easy processing. I went through the alternative explanations methodically in order of likelihood. The date was a mistake, a slip of the pen. The writer had written the wrong date. Possible. The description of the orange tent was coincidence. Orange tents were not uncommon. Gravel bars on the Ho were not uncommon. The combination was not impossible. Possible. The description of the campsite had been written after the fact, from a different location based on the writer's plan to camp here. People wrote trail journals prospectively sometimes, logging planned stops as if they'd occurred. Possible. All of it possible. None of it settling. I turned to the next entry. The 5th entry was dated the day after tomorrow. It described a section of trail I hadn't walked yet, a place called the 5 Mile Island Camp, which was on my map as a designated site I'd planned to stop at. The description was precise. The way the river braided around a gravel island at that point, the particular configuration of the established fire ring, the stand of old-growth Sitka that came down to the water's edge on the eastern bank. I had never been to 5 Mile Island Camp. I had read a description of it on a trail forum 2 months ago when I was planning the trip. The description in the journal matched what I'd read. This was still explainable. Someone who'd been on this trail before, who knew these landmarks, who wrote their journals in advance as a planning exercise. Someone who'd lost their notebook on a previous trip, or left it deliberately. I turned to the last entry. It was dated 4 days from now, the day I planned to be back at the trailhead. The entry was 2 sentences. The first sentence described the trailhead parking lot. My car was the only vehicle there, which it would be, because I'd started a Tuesday and would finish a Saturday when the weekend crowds hadn't yet arrived. The make of the car wasn't specified, but the color was. Gray, which is the color of my car, a detail I had shared with exactly one person before this trip, the friend I'd texted my itinerary to as a safety check-in. The second sentence said, "She made it back," past tense. I sat in my orange tent on the gravel bar of the Ho River, with the sound of the water all around me, and read those 3 words, and understood for the first time in my adult life what it felt like to have language. Do something to your body that your body couldn't immediately recover from. Not fear exactly. Something more structural than fear. The feeling of a load-bearing assumption. Failing. The ground of what you take for granted, shifting under everything you've built on top of it. She made it back. Not, she will make it back. Not, I hope she makes it back. Past tense, unqualified. Written by someone who had not yet been where I was, on a page that described where I was in accurate detail, sealed in a waterlogged composition notebook in a rainforest where I was the only person on this section of trail. Past tense means the writer knew the outcome. Past tense means the writer was writing from a point after the thing had already happened. Past tense means someone, somewhere. At some time, I cannot locate in any sequence that makes sense, already knew I was going to be here and already knew how it ended. I did not sleep well that night. I kept the journal next to my head, and I kept the tent zipper within reach, and I lay awake listening to the river and thinking about the grammar of those 3 words, turning them over, looking for the angle at which they became something other than what they appeared to be. I didn't find one. I finished the trail. 4 days, as planned. I reached the trailhead on Saturday morning, and my car was the only one in the lot. I drove to the ranger station and tried to hand in the journal. The ranger on duty, a young woman with a methodical manner who clearly took lost property seriously, opened it and paged through it and looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read. She asked me where I'd found it. I told her mile 7 on a nurse log. She asked me when I'd found it. I told her the second day, mid-afternoon. She looked at the journal again. Then she looked at me. She said the journal was too water-damaged to make out most of the entries, and asked if I'd been able to read any of it. I looked at the pages she was holding. The ink had run. Every page was a gray wash of indistinct marks. The waterproof clarity I'd read by the night before dissolved into nothing, as if the ink had decided somewhere between my tent and the ranger station to finally do what waterlogged ink does. I told her no. I told her I hadn't been able to read any of it. She tagged it and filed it, and I walked back to my gray car in the empty parking lot and sat there for a long time before I started the engine. She made it back. I drove home. I don't know what else to tell you. I drove home. The woods were never empty. That's what every single one of these stories keeps whispering. Underneath all the details, underneath the timestamps and the boot prints and the fires that mirror each other across dark water. Not that something is out there hunting you, just that the assumption of solitude, the thing we carry into the trees like a lantern, is sometimes the most dangerous thing we bring. Stay safe out there, and if something feels wrong, if the trail markers don't match, if the silence has a shape, if someone you don't recognize knows your campsite before you've described it, trust that feeling. It has been keeping people alive a lot longer than logic has. This is Mr. Darkveil. If these stories found you at night, in the dark, with the sound of something outside your window that you're telling yourself is just the wind. Welcome. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe, because there are more doors to open, and I promise you, not all of them lead somewhere you've been before.